The kingdom of Aldermere measured greatness in glittering ballrooms, towering castles, and family names older than memory, yet no noble inspired more fascination than Duke Lucien Ashford, the young master of the wealthiest duchy in the realm. Courtiers admired his sharp mind, generals praised his discipline, and merchants envied the prosperity of his lands, but every whispered conversation eventually drifted toward the same mystery. Why had the kingdom's most desirable bachelor rejected every woman presented before him? Over 6 relentless years, more than 50 noble ladies had arrived wearing jeweled gowns, flawless smiles, and carefully rehearsed charm, only to leave with broken expectations. Some claimed he was arrogant beyond reason. Others insisted his heart had frozen long ago. Children repeated stories of the Ice Duke, believing he had never laughed, never loved, and never intended to do either. Each spring the royal court decorated magnificent halls with fresh flowers and golden banners for another season of introductions, and each spring Lucien departed before the first dance, leaving hopeful families staring after an empty doorway. The spectacle had become so predictable that musicians quietly wagered how long he would remain before disappearing again. No one guessed that every graceful invitation awakened memories he desperately wished to forget. When Lucien had been only a boy, his parents had occupied the grandest chambers in Ashford Castle while living as complete strangers beneath the same roof. His father viewed marriage as another political treaty, valuable only for strengthening alliances and preserving influence. His mother, once known for joyful laughter, slowly faded into silence, wandering endless corridors whose polished marble reflected loneliness more faithfully than light. Young Lucien often hid outside the drawing room, hearing conversation stripped of affection and filled instead with negotiations, obligations, and cold courtesy. On the evening his mother quietly confessed that duty without love could imprison a soul more completely than chains, the words rooted themselves deep within his heart. After her death, he stood alone beside the chapel window and made a promise that never left him. He would never bind another life to his own unless genuine love walked beside them both. Years later that vow still guided every difficult decision, though no one outside his closest servants understood why every proposal earned the same respectful refusal. The queen finally decided patience had expired. She summoned Lucien to the royal palace on a gray morning when rain coated every stone courtyard with silver reflections. Inside the throne room, ministers watched silently as the monarch regarded the duke with measured disappointment rather than anger. She acknowledged his remarkable service to the kingdom and praised the prosperity he had created across Ashford lands, but reminded him that powerful families required stable heirs and visible unity. She offered one final year to choose a wife willingly. If he failed, certain royal privileges, military authority, and succession rights would be withdrawn. Her words echoed through the vast chamber with the certainty of a judge announcing sentence. Lucien bowed respectfully, accepted the decree without argument, and walked away carrying a burden heavier than any armor he had worn in battle. Behind him, ambitious nobles exchanged hopeful smiles, already imagining which daughter might finally melt the Ice Duke before the deadline arrived. Far beyond the capital, where rolling hills replaced marble towers and wildflowers colored narrow paths, the quiet village of Rosehaven welcomed each sunrise without concern for royal gossip. There lived Clara Evermont, whose days were filled not with courtly ambitions but with simple acts of compassion that stitched her community together. Every morning she taught village children to read beneath the shade of an ancient oak whose branches stretched like welcoming arms across the schoolyard. In the afternoons she carefully repaired worn books inside the modest library her late grandfather had cherished, preserving every fragile page because she believed forgotten stories deserved another chance to be heard. Evenings belonged to healing. Guided by everything her grandfather had taught her before his passing, she prepared herbal remedies, dressed wounds, comforted frightened patients, and accepted payment only when struggling families insisted. She greeted every neighbor with the same gentle respect whether they owned fertile farmland or little more than hope. One afternoon she paused while carrying medicine simply to rescue an injured songbird tangled among thorny vines, smiling with quiet satisfaction when it finally lifted into the bright sky. Those who knew Clara admired not merely her kindness but her unwavering belief that titles measured status while character revealed true worth. Only days after leaving the palace, Lucien chose to inspect remote Ashford lands surrounding Rosehaven, preferring solitude to endless speculation inside the capital. Dark clouds gathered unexpectedly across the hills, swallowing the afternoon sunlight beneath a curtain of thunder. Rain soon transformed narrow roads into rivers of mud, yet Lucien urged his powerful horse onward, determined to reach higher ground before the storm worsened. A deafening crack split the air as lightning struck an ancient tree beside the trail. Startled beyond control, The frightened horse reared violently near an old wooden bridge already weakened by rushing floodwaters. The planks shattered beneath the sudden weight, throwing rider and mount into the roaring river below. Villagers rushed toward the banks in horror, shouting helplessly above the storm, but the current dragged the struggling stranger farther downstream with terrifying speed. Without hesitation, Clara dropped her basket of herbs, plunged into the icy water, fought the relentless current, reached the exhausted man, and pulled him toward the shore through sheer determination. Coughing and bruised, Lucien looked up as she wrapped his injured arm, scolded him for riding into dangerous weather, and briskly walked away to answer another cry for help, never asking his name, never offering a bow, never realizing she had just rescued the Duke who could not stop watching her disappear. Lucien returned to Ashford Castle carrying more than bruises from the river. Every physician declared his injuries minor, yet none could explain why the Duke lingered beside windows overlooking distant hills instead of attending council meetings with his usual precision. He remembered the woman whose hands had steadied his wounded arm without trembling, whose voice had carried more concern than admiration, and whose eyes had regarded him without recognizing rank or privilege. She had spoken to him as though he were simply another traveler who had made a foolish decision during a storm. The memory unsettled him because it felt strangely liberating. For the first time in years, someone had looked beyond the title that had defined every conversation since childhood. Days passed, but the image of Clara walking away without expecting gratitude refused to fade. Eventually Lucien abandoned every excuse he offered his advisors and announced another inspection of his western estates, concealing the truth even from himself. He was not returning to examine fields or taxes. He was returning to discover whether the extraordinary woman by the river truly existed beyond memory. Rosehaven greeted him with the familiar scent of fresh bread, blooming lavender, and damp earth warmed beneath gentle sunlight. Villagers recognized the quiet traveler from the storm rather than the Duke whose portrait hung inside distant government buildings. Clara was arranging repaired books across rough wooden shelves when he entered the tiny library carrying a carefully wrapped collection of new volumes purchased anonymously through a merchant. She thanked the delivery man, smiled with sincere appreciation, and immediately began cataloging the books without wondering who had paid for them. When Lucien finally stepped inside, hoping perhaps for surprise or curiosity, she simply handed him a stack of damaged texts and asked whether he minded carrying them to the schoolhouse. He accepted before remembering that no one had ever assigned him such an ordinary task. The children waiting beneath the great oak welcomed the books with delighted cheers, while Clara thanked him with the same warm smile she offered every helpful neighbor. There was no special treatment, no awkward deference, only quiet expectation that capable hands should assist whenever they could. The following week Lucien returned again, inventing another inspection that conveniently ended near Rosehaven. He arrived expecting conversation but found Clara balancing on a ladder while repairing broken shutters outside the school. Without ceremony she pointed toward a pile of lumber and asked if he knew how to use a hammer. He admitted he did not. Rather than laughing, she patiently demonstrated every careful movement until he managed to replace the first warped board himself. The work blistered his hands and left sawdust clinging stubbornly to his sleeves, yet an unfamiliar satisfaction settled inside him as children applauded his crooked effort with generous enthusiasm. Before leaving, Clara thanked him not because he was important, but because he had genuinely helped. That distinction quietly reshaped something within him. His visits became increasingly frequent. Sometimes Clara asked him to repair fences damaged by wandering livestock. Other mornings she entrusted him with baskets of medicine destined for elderly villagers unable to travel. During harvest season he joined farmers lifting heavy bundles beneath the bright autumn sky, discovering that shared labor created conversations more honest than any exchanged inside palace halls. He listened to stories of ordinary hopes, simple disappointments, and stubborn resilience. Children tugged impatiently at his sleeves, begging him to read adventure tales aloud beneath the old oak after lessons ended. At first his voice sounded stiff and formal, but their laughter gradually dissolved every trace of ceremony. The villagers eventually nicknamed him the Quiet Traveler because he preferred listening to boasting and because he always appeared whenever extra hands were needed. An elderly baker insisted on slipping warm bread into his satchel each evening, refusing payment with cheerful determination. Lucien found himself laughing unexpectedly over burned loaves during a failed attempt to help inside the bakery, and the sound startled him more than anyone else. Happiness, he realized, required astonishingly little space when pride stepped aside. Meanwhile, anonymous improvements quietly transformed Rosehaven. The school received stronger desks crafted from fine oak. The library gained weatherproof windows and shelves sturdy enough to protect precious books. Seeds arrived for struggling families after an especially harsh season. Clara thanked unknown benefactors in her evening prayers, believing generosity multiplied when no recognition was sought. She noticed that the quiet traveler often appeared shortly after each unexpected gift, yet she never connected him with the donations because he worked beside everyone else without claiming credit. Instead, she measured him by smaller things: the patience he showed frightened children, the care he took carrying medicine through muddy roads, and the humility with which he accepted correction whenever she explained a better way to accomplish a task. Slowly, almost without noticing, she began trusting his quiet presence. As winter approached, Lucien recognized that concealing his identity felt increasingly dishonest. One crisp afternoon, after helping repair the roof of a widow's cottage, he invited Clara to walk beside the frozen stream where they had first crossed paths after the storm. Snowflakes drifted softly between them while silence lingered without discomfort. Gathering unexpected courage, he confessed that he was not merely a traveler inspecting estates. He was Lucien Ashford, Duke of the Western Duchy, heir to one of the kingdom's oldest families, and the man every noble household expected to marry before the Queen's deadline. For a brief moment Clara simply regarded him, absorbing the revelation without visible astonishment. Then she smiled gently and resumed walking. "You are still the man who nearly drowned because he challenged a storm," she said with quiet amusement. "A title tells me how strangers greet you. It does not tell me who you are." Her calm acceptance struck deeper than disbelief ever could. She neither apologized for speaking plainly nor rushed to offer elaborate respect. Instead, she asked whether he would help distribute blankets before nightfall because colder weather threatened several elderly residents. Lucien answered without hesitation. Together they crossed the village carrying bundles from door to door until stars filled the darkening sky. Every grateful smile strengthened his conviction that he had found the life his heart had sought for years without recognizing it. Winter melted gradually into spring, painting Rosehaven with blossoms that scented every breeze. Their companionship deepened through shared routines rather than dramatic declarations. They drank tea after long afternoons repairing books, debated favorite stories while children played nearby, and watched crimson sunset settle across rolling fields in companionable silence. During the harvest festival, Clara persuaded him to join villagers dancing around lanterns suspended from ancient branches. His steps were clumsy, provoking cheerful laughter from everyone, including himself. Standing beneath the glowing lights afterward, Lucien understood with perfect clarity that he loved the woman beside him. Days later he returned carrying no royal procession, no musicians, and no glittering audience. He offered only a simple ring and an honest promise that he wished to spend every ordinary day with her. Clara's eyes filled with emotion as she gently closed his fingers around the ring once more. Softly she whispered, "I will never marry a man because a kingdom expects him to." Then she turned away, leaving the Duke, who had rejected every noble lady, standing alone, finally understanding the ache he had unknowingly given so many others. The news traveled through Aldermere with astonishing speed, carried by merchants, servants, and ambitious courtiers eager to embellish every detail. The Duke, who had refused more than 50 noble ladies, had finally offered his heart, only to have it returned with quiet dignity by an unknown village woman. What began as astonishment quickly transformed into outrage among the kingdom's most powerful families. Noble mothers who had once dreamed of seeing their daughters become Duchess of Ashford suddenly viewed Clara Evermont as an obstacle standing between their ambitions and unimaginable influence. Banquet halls echoed with poisonous speculation instead of music. Some claimed she had manipulated Lucien through clever deception. Others insisted no ordinary woman could inspire such devotion without unnatural means. Every rumor traveled farther than the truth because envy eagerly supplied details where facts were missing. Rosehaven, once ignored by nearly everyone beyond neighboring villages, became the unwilling center of whispered accusations and carefully disguised resentment. Lucien ignored every malicious story. Instead of retreating into silence after Clara refused his proposal, he continued visiting Rosehaven with the same quiet determination that had first drawn him there. He repaired broken carts, helped farmers prepare spring fields, and spent evenings reading beside children whose trust never depended upon noble titles. Clara noticed his unwavering kindness but remained firm in her decision. She had not rejected his love. She had rejected the possibility that love might become another obligation imposed by crown and court. She wanted the man who willingly carried books through muddy streets, not the Duke cornered by political expectation. Although her heart softened whenever she watched him laugh with village children, She refused to surrender the principles that had guided her entire life. Lucien sensed the difference, understanding that patience had become another expression of love. The queen, however, viewed matters differently. Concerned that growing scandal threatened stability within the kingdom, she summoned Lucien once more to the palace. Waiting beside the throne stood Duchess Evelyn Beaumont, celebrated throughout the capital for her beauty, refinement, and influential family connections. Courtiers exchanged satisfied smiles, convinced the queen had finally arranged a match worthy of the Ashford name. Calmly but firmly, the queen announced her intention to formalize an engagement between Lucien and Evelyn before summer ended. The proposal promised stronger alliances, calmer politics, and renewed confidence among noble houses. Every eye turned toward the duke, expecting reluctant acceptance. Instead, Lucien stepped forward, bowed respectfully, and refused before anyone could celebrate. His voice remained steady as he declared he would never enter a marriage without genuine love, regardless of consequence. Silence spread across the throne room like gathering frost. Evelyn's proud expression hardened into humiliation, while the queen's disappointment deepened into quiet concern. By choosing honesty over convenience, Lucien unknowingly transformed political frustration into personal vengeance. Within days, darker rumors emerged. Anonymous pamphlets appeared across nearby towns accusing Clara of practicing forbidden magic learned from mysterious healers hidden beyond the kingdom's borders. Others insisted she had enchanted the duke during the storm beside the river, stealing his reason through ancient charms disguised as medicine. Villagers who knew Clara dismissed every accusation with offended disbelief, yet strangers arriving from distant counties eyed her cottage with suspicious curiosity. Several frightened parents hesitated before sending children to the school she lovingly maintained. Though hurt by the growing distrust, Clara refused to answer hatred with anger. She continued teaching lessons beneath the ancient oak, mending damaged books and treating every patient who sought her help. Lucien publicly condemned the lies, but each denial seemed only to inspire fresh inventions among those determined to destroy what they could not control. Behind the spreading rumors stood Duchess Evelyn, whose wounded pride had curdled into relentless bitterness. Unable to tolerate rejection before the entire royal court, she secretly hired desperate mercenaries willing to perform disgraceful work for generous payment. Their instructions were simple. Burn Rosehaven's school and library during the night, erase the place most closely associated with Clara's influence, and ensure the village blamed misfortune rather than noble interference. They waited until a windy evening when lanterns flickered uncertainly against gathering darkness. Flames climbed dry wooden walls with terrifying speed, fed by strong gusts that scattered sparks across nearby rooftops. Panicked cries shattered the peaceful night as smoke swallowed classrooms filled with precious books and trapped children attending an evening reading circle. Lucien happened to be returning from a neighboring farm when the first desperate shouts reached him. Without pausing to consider danger, he raced toward the blazing school alongside Clara and dozens of terrified villagers. Heat rolled through the air in suffocating waves while burning beams groaned ominously overhead. Clara heard frightened voices trapped inside and rushed through the doorway before anyone could stop her. Lucien followed immediately despite choking smoke that blurred every path. Together they found frightened children huddled beneath collapsing rafters. Clara guided the youngest toward broken windows where waiting villagers pulled them safely outside one by one. Lucien lifted heavy timbers blocking the final exit, straining against unbearable weight as fire consumed everything around him. Just as the last child escaped into waiting arms, a burning support beam crashed from the ceiling. Lucien shoved Clara clear of the impact before the blazing timber struck his shoulder and threw him violently onto the floor. Villagers dragged both of them outside moments before the roof collapsed behind them in a storm of sparks and ash. The following days unfolded inside a quiet room at Rosehaven's modest clinic rather than Ashford Castle. Lucien drifted between restless sleep and painful wakefulness while Clara remained constantly beside him. She cleaned burns with practiced hands, prepared healing herbs exactly as her grandfather had taught, and read aloud from rescued books whenever fever clouded his thoughts. Sometimes he woke to find children sitting silently nearby, leaving flowers gathered from spring meadows before tiptoeing away. The library lay in ruins, yet its stories survived inside grateful hearts. Watching Clara tirelessly care for everyone despite losing so much herself, Lucien realized her greatest strength had never been healing wounds. It was refusing to let suffering extinguish compassion. As his strength slowly returned, estate officials delivered salvaged records recovered from Ashford archives destroyed years earlier by flood damage. Searching absent-mindedly through weathered ledgers, Lucien discovered correspondence between his childhood boarding school and an anonymous benefactor who had quietly funded hundreds of donated books during the bleakest years of the Academy's existence. Without those gifts, the small library where lonely young Lucien had hidden from grief would have vanished entirely. Tucked inside the final letter rested the benefactor's true name, revealed only after his death to settle forgotten accounts. Lucien Evermont, Clara's grandfather. The man whose generosity had unknowingly shaped the curious, compassionate boy long before he became the guarded duke stood speechless, clutching the faded letter as the astonishing truth settled over him. Before he could share the discovery with Clara, he noticed her bedside chair standing empty, and beside it rested a neatly folded envelope bearing only his name. Lucien stared at the folded envelope for several silent moments before finally breaking the wax seal with trembling fingers. The familiar, graceful handwriting inside belonged to Clara, yet every carefully chosen word carried the weight of farewell rather than comfort. She wrote that the kingdom had begun suffering because of her presence, that children had nearly died in a fire meant for a woman who had never desired power, and that she could no longer watch him sacrifice his future while endless conflict spread around them. She refused to become the reason honorable people turned against one another. Near the bottom of the page, however, one final sentence stopped his breathing. If your happiness belongs to a crown, forget me. If it belongs to me, then do not send soldiers. Come yourself. Lucien read those words again and again until they ceased feeling like goodbye and became something far more demanding. They were not an invitation to rescue her. They were a challenge to discover whether the man she loved truly existed beyond the title he had inherited. Before sunrise the next morning, the castle awoke expecting the duke to prepare for another meeting with the queen. Instead, Lucien entered the great hall wearing simple traveling clothes instead of embroidered velvet. He unclasped the jeweled crest from his cloak and placed it upon the long oak table where generations of Ashfords had planned wars and treaties. Next came the ceremonial sword that symbolized his authority, followed by the signet ring used to seal ducal decrees. His steward watched in stunned silence as Lucien entrusted the daily governance of the duchy to capable advisors, instructing them to continue serving the people without waiting for his return. When loyal knights insisted on accompanying him, he refused every offer with quiet gratitude. If Clara wished to know who he truly was, no escort, banner, or royal protection could answer that question for him. Only the choices he made alone would reveal the truth. Word spread quickly that the duke had disappeared. The queen ordered discreet searches, believing he had been kidnapped by political enemies. Noble families whispered that heartbreak had finally broken the Ice Duke's proud spirit. None of them imagined that Lucien had exchanged luxurious chambers for dusty roads stretching across the kingdom. Carrying only a weathered satchel, a traveling cloak, and the letter folded safely against his heart, he followed scattered rumors of a young healer establishing schools wherever forgotten children gathered. Every village offered a different direction. Some believed she had crossed the eastern forests. Others insisted she had traveled north toward snow-covered valleys. Lucien accepted every uncertain lead because the journey itself gradually became more important than the destination. The first weeks tested him more harshly than any battlefield ever had. Heavy rains washed away bridges, forcing him to help stranded travelers rebuild safe crossings before continuing onward. An elderly farmer collapsed while repairing a broken mill wheel, and Lucien spent 2 days restoring the machinery so the surrounding villages would not lose their harvest. Near a lonely mountain pass, he found frightened siblings trying to pull their injured father home after a wagon accident. Remembering Clara's lessons, he splinted the man's fractured leg with careful hands, gathered medicinal herbs growing nearby, and remained until the family could safely continue. No one asked whether he belonged to noble blood. No one cared. They remembered only that a quiet stranger had appeared exactly when kindness was needed. As the months unfolded, Lucien discovered that generosity possessed its own remarkable momentum. In one riverside village he repaired the leaking roof of a tiny schoolhouse before moving on at dawn. Weeks later another traveler recognized him and thanked him because children there no longer missed lessons during storms. He helped an exhausted widow rebuild the fence protecting her vegetable garden from wandering livestock, only to learn later that neighboring families had joined together to improve every neglected farm nearby. In a crowded market town he intervened when armed bandits attempted to rob merchants returning from the harvest fair. Although outnumbered, his years of military training allowed him to protect innocent people until local guards arrived. The grateful townsfolk never learned they had been defended by one of the kingdom's greatest commanders. They simply began telling stories about a mysterious gray traveler who appeared wherever hope seemed ready to disappear. The legend traveled farther than Lucien himself. Children eagerly watched distant roads, hoping the gray traveler might visit their village next. Mothers repeated tales of the stranger who fixed broken wells before accepting a meal. Old soldiers admired the unknown wanderer who refused rewards after protecting caravans from thieves. Teachers spoke of a quiet man who donated books anonymously, then spent evenings reading aloud to children too poor to own a single volume. Listening secretly to those stories around countless evening fires, Lucien realized something astonishing. People valued his actions far more than they would have valued his name. For the first time in his life, respect had been earned rather than inherited, and the realization filled him with a peace no title had ever provided. Winter surrendered slowly to spring as Lucien crossed the final mountain range separating him from a secluded valley mentioned by a shepherd. Wildflowers covered the slopes like scattered paint beneath brilliant sunlight, while birdsong drifted across crystal streams winding between ancient trees. There, nestled against the hillside, stood a collection of modest stone buildings surrounding a flourishing garden. Children laughed while carrying baskets of vegetables. Elderly villagers studied beside young apprentices beneath open windows. Shelves filled with carefully restored books lined the walls of a bright schoolroom connected to a simple clinic fragrant with herbs drying from wooden rafters. It was neither castle nor monastery. It was exactly the kind of place Clara had always dreamed of creating. He found her kneeling beside a little girl whose scraped knee had already begun healing beneath a fresh bandage. Time seemed to pause as Clara looked up and met his eyes across the courtyard. Surprise flickered across her face before soft warmth replaced it. She stood slowly, dismissed the grateful child with a reassuring smile, and walked toward him without hurry. For several heartbeats neither of them spoke. The silence carried months of longing, unanswered questions, and quiet transformation. Lucien finally admitted he had crossed the kingdom not to persuade her to return but because every mile had revealed the man he wished to remain for the rest of his life. Clara listened carefully, searching his face as though measuring every unseen change. Then she smiled with unmistakable affection, yet gently stepped back instead of embracing him. "You found me," she said softly, "but that was never the hardest part." Lucien nodded, already sensing the lesson still waiting. She looked toward the laughing children filling the courtyard before meeting his eyes once more. "Love is not proving you can reach me," she whispered. "It is proving you will remain this man after you do." Before he could answer, the distant sound of galloping horses echoed through the valley, and every joyful voice suddenly fell silent. The thunder of approaching horses rolled across the peaceful valley, scattering birds into the bright afternoon sky and silencing the cheerful laughter that had filled the courtyard only moments before. Children instinctively gathered near Clara, while several elderly villagers stepped protectively in front of the small school despite possessing little strength to offer. Lucien calmly moved beside Clara without reaching for a weapon, because he no longer carried the ceremonial sword that had once defined his authority. As the riders emerged from the forest, their banners revealed the royal crest rather than the insignia of hostile nobles. At their head rode the queen herself, accompanied by only a modest escort instead of an army. She dismounted slowly, studying the valley where children of every background learned together, patients received treatment without payment, and neighbors worked side by side without concern for birth or status. The silence that followed held no anger, only careful observation. The queen walked through the courtyard without ceremony, pausing beside the humble library where repaired books rested neatly on handmade shelves. She watched a young orphan patiently helping an elderly farmer learn to read, then crossed into the small clinic where Clara's apprentices prepared herbal medicines for travelers waiting outside. Nothing about the place resembled the grandeur of royal institutions, yet everything reflected purpose. Lucien waited quietly, refusing to defend himself before judgment had even been spoken. Finally the queen turned toward him with thoughtful eyes rather than disappointed ones. "You abandoned court," she said. "I left a title," Lucien answered calmly. "I did not abandon my duty." She glanced around once more. "And what duty is that?" Lucien looked toward the children filling the courtyard with hopeful voices. "To leave the kingdom stronger than I found it." The queen remained silent for a long moment before asking Clara a question instead. "If he returned to the palace tomorrow exactly as he once was, would you follow him?" Clara met the monarch's gaze without fear. "No." "And if he never became duke again?" "I would still remain beside him." The honesty in her answer carried no hesitation, no calculation, and no desire for advantage. For perhaps the first time since issuing her ultimatum months earlier, the queen understood that Lucien had not been escaping responsibility. He had been discovering the only reason worthy of carrying it. News of the valley spread quickly after the royal visit. People expected the queen to command Lucien's immediate return to the capital, yet instead she quietly granted him time to present a vision for the future of Ashford. During countless evenings beside Clara, surrounded by children reading beneath lantern light, Lucien reflected upon everything he had witnessed during his journey across the kingdom. He remembered villages without teachers, clinics without medicine, libraries without books, and families whose greatest dreams had depended upon the kindness of strangers. Power had always flowed toward castles, while hope struggled to reach forgotten places. If he truly wished to honor the promise growing within his heart, the duchy itself would have to change. Months later, workers from every corner of Ashford gathered around an abandoned royal hunting palace that had stood empty for generations. Instead of restoring it into another luxurious residence, Lucien ordered its magnificent halls transformed into something no noble family had ever imagined. Ballrooms became classrooms flooded with sunlight. Banquet chambers became libraries lined with thousands of carefully chosen books. Guest suites became hospital wards where skilled healers would care for anyone regardless of wealth. Beautiful gardens were replanted with medicinal herbs, fruit trees, and quiet spaces where children could learn beneath open skies. Craftsmen volunteered beside farmers. Scholars worked alongside carpenters. Noble families, initially skeptical, gradually found themselves inspired by the remarkable unity taking shape before their eyes. The palace no longer represented privilege. It became a promise. When construction finally ended, invitations traveled throughout the kingdom announcing a grand ceremony unlike any in living memory. Crowds filled the surrounding fields before sunrise, convinced they would witness the long-awaited wedding between the duke and the village healer who had transformed him. Merchants decorated market streets with flowers. Musicians prepared joyful melodies. Even foreign dignitaries arrived expecting magnificent displays of aristocratic splendor. Clara appeared wearing an elegant but simple gown reflecting the quiet grace she had always carried. Lucien wore formal ducal robes for the first time since leaving the castle, though something about him had fundamentally changed. The proud distance that once surrounded the Ice Duke had disappeared, replaced by calm warmth earned through months of service rather than inherited status. Instead of leading everyone toward a cathedral, Lucien guided the assembled crowd into the heart of the newly restored academy. Sunlight poured through towering windows, illuminating shelves overflowing with books rescued, donated, and lovingly restored from across the duchy. Hundreds of children waited inside, representing villages, towns, noble households, and humble farms alike. Their excited whispers echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling as Lucien stepped onto a modest platform placed at the center rather than upon an elevated throne. Every noble present expected him to announce wedding vows. Instead, he slowly removed the ceremonial sword hanging at his side. For generations that blade had symbolized Ashford authority, military command, and inherited power. Without speaking, Lucien carried it toward a beautifully crafted glass display standing beside the academy entrance. He placed the sword inside, closed the case, and turned back toward the astonished gathering. "My ancestors built castles to protect their people," he said, his steady voice filling every corner of the hall. Many expected him to produce a jeweled ring glittering with unimaginable wealth. Instead he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver key polished smooth through careful handling. He knelt before her, not upon marble beneath painted ceilings, but surrounded by children whose futures already reflected the life they had built together. Holding the key in open hands, he smiled. "Every castle I inherited belonged to my family," he said softly. "This door belongs to every child who dreams beyond the circumstances of birth. This academy, these books, these healers, and every future they create belong to tomorrow. Clara Evermont, will you help me spend the rest of our lives building that tomorrow together?" Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes as she accepted the simple silver key instead of a crown or precious jewels. "I will," she whispered. "Not because you are a duke. Because you never stopped becoming the man I met beside the river." The academy erupted into joyful applause. Children cheered loudest of all, surrounding the couple with laughter instead of formal ceremony. Even hardened nobles found themselves wiping away quiet tears. The queen stepped forward, smiling with unmistakable pride, and declared the house of learning and healing open to every citizen of the kingdom forever. At that moment, Ashford ceased being remembered merely as the richest duchy in Aldermere. It became the place where compassion received equal honor with courage. Years flowed onward, carrying the promise of that extraordinary day into every corner of the realm. Smaller academies inspired by the original opened throughout distant villages once forgotten by the crown. Traveling healers trained beneath Clara before returning to serve isolated communities. Former orphans became respected teachers, physicians, architects, and scholars whose achievements transformed countless lives. Nobles increasingly measured prestige not by lavish banquets but by the schools, clinics, and libraries they established for ordinary families. Travelers crossing the kingdom spoke less about Ashford's wealth than about its generosity, describing a duchy where opportunity reached children regardless of surname or fortune. On the anniversary of the Academy's opening, Lucien and Clara quietly slipped away from the celebrations and returned to the riverside where fate had first brought them together. The old bridge, once destroyed by the storm that nearly claimed Lucien's life, had long since been rebuilt stronger than before. Their 3 children raced laughing along the grassy bank, pretending the weathered silver key was the greatest treasure in the world. Each insisted on carrying it, not because it unlocked a grand palace, but because their parents had taught them it opened a place where every child belonged. Watching them, Lucien smiled with peaceful gratitude. "I spent years believing everyone wanted my title," he said softly. "Now I know the greatest title I have ever earned is husband and father." Clara slipped her hand into his. "And you earned both." Together they crossed the bridge as the evening sun painted the river in shades of gold. In the distance, the academy bell rang across flourishing fields where children still hurried toward lessons, laughter rising with the wind that carried hope instead of fear. The Duke who had once rejected every lady had finally chased the one woman who ignored him, only to discover that love was never the finish line. It was the path that transformed a lonely ruler into a faithful husband, a devoted father, and a leader whose greatest legacy was not the castle he inherited, but the countless lives forever changed because he chose kindness over power.